Good morning. I'm hoping this technology will work for me this morning. I'm going to try to do a couple of slides. Thank you, Nick, for getting me started. Just want to see if the advancement is correct. Yes, okay, there we go. I'd like to speak to us this morning. Oh, did I do that? Okay, that's not the right slide. All right. I'd like to speak to this morning from the theme, Ruth Takes a Role in the Hay. You know, the Bible is really a fun book to read sometimes. We have been given this image of the holiness of the Bible, and we approach it with that kind of deference. And I'm reading the book of Ruth, and really, this is a simple homework assignment. It'll take you all of 15 minutes to read it. And I'm reading the book of Ruth, and I'm like, what? What? No way. I'm telling you, it's quite scandalous, and it uses a lot of euphemisms, and that's why I chose this traditional euphemism as my title. But on the other hand, the story of Naomi and Ruth and her sister that went back is in every way as tragic as the story of Job that we talked about last week. Naomi was married. She had 2 sons. Her sons were married to beautiful women from Moab. Life was good. They'd left the famine back home and found food and welcome in a new community. And within a span of time, Naomi lost her husband, her 2 sons, and she was left, she, a widow, and her 2 widowed daughters. But what amazes me about the presentation of this tragedy in so many ways is the very matter-of-fact way that the story is related. It's presented as though this is just one of the options of life. And as we well know that certainly 2,000 years ago, life expectancy wasn't much more than 40 years. You live, you marry, you bear children, you die. And the passage of her husband and sons, we're not told why. It's as sudden as the death of Job's children, but it's not portrayed as a tragedy. It's simply portrayed as life. The response to this life is what this book is really about. Naomi's husband and her 2 sons have died. She's left a widow with 2 widowed daughters. What will she do? She decides to go back home. Now she's heard that the famine is over. But she encourages her daughters-in-law, who are both from that community, to stay in their land and start new lives. The one daughter, after putting up her initial resistance, capitulates, and she goes back to her mother's home to start a new life. But Ruth refuses to abandon Naomi and clings to her mother-in-law. You hear me right? Clings to her mother-in-law. Of all the mother-in-law jokes that we've heard, Ruth is a contradiction to all of them. Rather than go home to her own mother, she clings to Naomi, her mother-in-law. This act of devotion, faithfulness, and commitment was so extraordinary that Ruth has become the very model of devotion and love. And her words of devotion, they truly stand as a model of commitment. These words, okay, I'm not getting the right, I need Naomi's pledge. Yes, thank you. These words, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. These words have become the standard of commitment. Now, the verb to cling, it says in the text that Ruth clung to Naomi. That verb to cling is used only one other time in the Bible, when in Genesis it talks about a man will leave his mother and father and cling unto his wife. I think they slipped that one in there, because we have here that same verb being used to express the relationship between two women. Can I get the slide with Ruth clinging to Naomi? I guess we're not connected to the same. Yes, thank you. And here we have Ruth clinging to Naomi. This time it was used to talk about a woman leaving her mother and her father to cling unto another mother. But this commitment to Naomi was soon to be tested, because they did, in fact, have to go back home and figure out how to make a life for themselves. And life in that world and at that time for women depended on having a man. When Naomi and Ruth arrive in Jerusalem, they are starving. They have nothing, and they have to figure out how to live. And one thing that the poor were able to do in that community was to follow along and to glean after the harvest had been taken. All that which was left on the ground, all that which was kind of scattered about, the poor were allowed to come in. It wasn't considered stealing. They were allowed to come in and glean after the harvest in the fields. Now, from the moment they arrive in Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth have to figure out how to survive. Two widowed women in a world where life depends on having a man. So at first glance, it seems that Naomi and Ruth concoct a very traditional scheme of seduction to get Ruth a husband. Naomi literally tells her daughter-in-law how to go about getting a man. And she says to him, now says to her, I want you to go into the barn at the end of the day, and there you will find Boaz sleep upon the gatherings of barley that he had brought in that day. And I looked it up. Barley can be made into hay. So, in other words, Naomi was telling Ruth, go take a roll in the hay with Boaz. I'm just reading the Bible, y'all. That's what it says. Go take a roll in the hay. I need the roll in the hay slide, Nick. There we go. There we go. Boaz was asleep in the barn, and Naomi told Ruth to go and sneak into the barn, and the text says, uncover his feet. Well, that's not what it means. That's yet another euphemism for sexual intercourse. Now, the other thing about this scheme that Naomi and Ruth were executing, you see, Boaz was not married, and he was an old man. And Ruth was a young woman. So you can imagine his surprise when he found this young woman rolling with him in the hay. And he advises her, read your homework now, he advises her to leave the barn in the wee hours of the morning so that no one will see her. So in other words, Ruth takes her walk of shame and goes back to Naomi. Now, the remarkable thing about this story is that while the whole plot unfolds within an extremely patriarchal system, Ruth has one very feminist objective. Her sole purpose in all that she does is to find a way to keep her commitment to Naomi and to cling to Naomi. Boaz, of course, is very impressed. You know, we men are so easily manipulated. And he meets with the elders of the village in order to secure his rights to Ruth. Because all this was a very elaborate family system. And we've heard talk about Levirate marriage. And this was the way, this was their welfare system. When a woman was married to a man, and if they had no children, and she had no son to provide for her, then her husband's nearest brother or relative was obligated to marry her and to raise children in the dead brother's name. And there's another famous passage about a brother who did not want to perform his duty to his dead brother's wife. And so Boaz was not the closest relative. So he meets with the council elders at the gate of the village, and he negotiates with the closest relative. He says, now, you have the right to redeem the property that Naomi had title to through her husband Elimelech, but she couldn't possess it herself. She had to sell it to a man. And he said, oh, okay, well, then I think I'll buy that. He said, now, but when you buy the land, understand that Naomi and Ruth come with the deal. He said, oh, if you want to buy it, go right ahead. So Boaz buys the land and marries Ruth, and Naomi comes with them. And so Boaz unwittingly participates in this elaborate plan that Naomi and Ruth have concocted in order for them to stay together. Ruth bears a child, but she gives the child to Naomi, and all is now restored. Naomi has a son, Ruth has a husband, and they live happily ever after as a prehistoric modern family. That's what it says. But as we know, in our modern moment, it is love that makes a family. Most importantly, in the end of the story, Ruth clings to Naomi. She had pledged to her, wherever she lodged, that Ruth would lodge. And Ruth meant it in the reverse as well, that she would not leave her to go and to seek her own benefit, but would always look out for her mother-in-law. Where she lodged, Ruth would lodge. Her people would be Ruth's people, and her God would become Ruth's God. The legend continues into the New Testament that the child that Ruth bears is not only an ancestor to King David, but of course, therefore, an ancestor to Jesus. Ruth demonstrates that love between two women is as deep and profound as between a man and a woman or any other two persons who commit themselves to each other in love. You read that text again. Not only does she say, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, she says, and all of this I say, that nothing but death will separate us. Till death do us part is right there in the text of this story. And the women of Bethlehem pronounce a very interesting blessing. They have marveled at what Ruth has done, a Moabite woman for a Bethlehemite, a Moabite woman for an Israelite. Among people that were not her people, Ruth has gone to all of this effort to protect and to care for her mother-in-law. And they finally say, Naomi, Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. Praise doesn't get any higher than that. 7 being the number of perfection and sons being preferred to girls. But no, this story stands out in the whole of the biblical tradition to say that having a daughter can be better than having 7 sons. This story of commitment, this story of love, this story of resilience is an inspiration and a hope for all of us. Let the people of God say, amen.